like to talk to you for just a few minutes about a treaty called CIFTA. This is an abbreviation for, the Spanish abbreviation for the Inter-American Convention Against the Illicit Manufacture of and Trafficking in Firearms, Ammunition, Explosives, and Other Related Materials. So you can see why an abbreviation is convenient. This is a bad treaty, but it's not simply a bad treaty. It raises some broader issues that we should all be concerned about, issues that I'll recur to at the end of my remarks. What is the convention about? Well, its supposed purpose is, to quote it directly, to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit manufacturing of and trafficking in firearms, ammunition, explosives, and other related materials. The convention was signed by President Clinton in 1997. It has not, however, been presented to the Senate for ratification. President Obama, during a visit to Mexico, called for the treaty's ratification last year. Now, in theory, the treaty's purpose is sensible, the idea to curb illicit trafficking in arms. But, of course, as always, the devil is in the details. First, has the treaty had any practical impact? Let me just deal with this very briefly by saying that no, it has not, and it has been signed and ratified by almost all OAS members except the United States and Canada. The treaty, in practice, has done absolutely nothing to curb intra-American arms trafficking, arms smuggling, and illicit arms manufacture. For example, the convention has been signed and ratified by both Colombia and Venezuela, but it is all too clear that the convention has done absolutely nothing whatsoever to curb Venezuela's efforts to overthrow the democratically elected government of Colombia. In the United States, the convention is often justified on the grounds that it will reduce or eliminate arms smuggling across the U.S.-Mexican border. Some very exaggerated claims have been made about the level of U.S. responsibility for arms smuggling into Mexico, and I deal with these at length both in the long backgrounder that I've passed around and in the shorter post from the Foundry, which I've also distributed. But let me simply sum up by saying that these statistics are exaggerated, incorrect, and wildly out of proportion to reality in ways that I would be glad to discuss during the Q&A section. There are three major substantial dangers posed by the convention. First, the convention prohibits, as it puts it, the unlicensed, quote, manufacture or assembly of firearms, ammunition, explosives, and other related materials. The real nub of this definition is in the clause related materials, because the convention then goes on to define the related materials as, quote, any component, part, or replacement part of a firearm or an accessory which can be attached to a firearm. The crucial word there, I believe, is any. Thus, under the convention, the manufacture of any part at all, of a gun or an accessory for a gun would require a license. That would include springs, screws, slings for rifles, and any other portion of any firearm or any device which attaches to a firearm. That is a very broad range of items indeed. Because the treaty also seeks to cover assembly, any assembly work whatsoever, including something like tightening a screw or attaching a sling to a hunting rifle, would also require a federal license under the convention. Ultimately, if you work through what the convention actually covers, virtually every firearms owner in this country would have to be licensed as an assembler, as a manufacturer, or both under this convention, as well as, of course, the manufacturers of a great many items which are used in firearms, but which also have much broader uses beyond the firearms trade. What would this government inspection and registration system do? First, it would vastly expand the inspection power given to licensed manufacturers and assemblers under U.S. law to the ATF. It would seriously burden domestic and international commerce by extending the kind of controls that we place on the actions of firearms to all parts that are included in firearms. It raises enormous privacy considerations because the treaty not only requires the collection of all of this data and its retention by the federal government, it also requires that all information be shared with all foreign signatories of this treaty, including, among others, the government of Hugo Chavez. And it criminalizes an extraordinarily wide range of domestic activities that have nothing whatsoever to do with the illicit manufacture of arms or their illegal trafficking. In other words, it promises to enormously expand the reach of federal laws and to exacerbate the already serious problem of overcriminalization by making a wide range of activities illegal, even when, by any reasonable definition, they are contributors to no kind of crime whatsoever. If you think the convention is bad, however, I encourage you to go read the OAS's model legislation, which instructs countries on how, after they have ratified the treaty, they should implement it in their domestic law. Now, of course, the U.S. wouldn't have to use the model legislation, but it nonetheless is a very revealing statement about what the convention's advocates and the OAS want to achieve. The model legislation requires not simply a national gun registry, it requires a national ammunition registry down to each and every individual round of ammunition, which is to be individually identified with its owner and anyone who subsequently purchases it or to whom it is transferred. I think it's safe to say this is a bureaucratic impossibility as well as a Second Amendment, a privacy, and a trade nightmare. The second major problem with the convention is that it criminalizes the quote-unquote counseling of all the activities it prohibits. And it creates the legal basis for extradition for all the activities it prohibits, including the activity of counseling. In other words, by criminalizing counseling, the convention criminalizes speech. Under the convention, if I were to counsel you to attach a sling to a hunting rifle without a license, that would itself be a crime under the convention. This obviously raises enormous First Amendment concerns, concerns that I believe are exacerbated by the fact that leading administration appointees, specifically Harold Koh, have explicitly backed SIFTA as an emerging norm that should shape the interpretation of the First and Second Amendments. If the Senate were ever to consider SIFTA, it would have to adopt a reservation stating that the U.S. would refuse to acknowledge any activities under the realm of counseling as punishable under U.S. law. But I would also point out that even reservations like this are not enough. Simply by ratifying the convention, the U.S. would be approving of international instruments that criminalize the freedom of speech, and it would be giving aid and comfort to dictators around the Western Hemisphere, because simply by creating the crime of counseling, one gives an enormous advantage to dictators like Castro, like Chavez, who would then be given yet another way to accuse opponents of trumped-up crimes, that is, the crime of counseling something that was illicit under the convention, and chucking them in jail. Now, of course, dictators will do this anyhow, but there is no reason for the U.S. to lend explicit legal sanction to what should clearly be illegal and a violation of basic human rights. Third, and briefly, even leaving aside the problems it raises with the First and Second Amendment, the treaty is bad for U.S. sovereignty. It is yet another in a series of expansive, unenforceable treaties. Treaties like this are inherently anti-sovereignty because they bind the United States while not binding other signatories. The result is that the U.S. and its governing institutions are constrained when foreign signatories of the treaty in practice are unconstrained, and these one-way constraints are illegitimate and a violation of U.S. sovereignty. Where does SIFTA stand vis-a-vis the Senate? Well, there are individuals in this room who know more about this than I do, so I won't go on about it at length. Let me simply say that I see no possibility that it will be ratified or considered before November. After that, it depends on the results of the elections, and because of the supposed tie-in with Mexico, any movement on immigration reform and on border control. But I would also add that whether the Senate considers the convention now or later doesn't really matter all that much. Because, and here I come to the three broader dangers that are referred to at the opening, this convention is going to stick around whether or not the Senate considers it now or later. We have a lot of treaties out there that are like this. The Senate voted down a Kyoto predecessor by 97-0, but Kyoto is still out there, and it's still driving U.S. policy right now. The ICC was signed and then immediately rejected by President Clinton, who told President Bush not to submit it for ratification to the Senate because it was a bad treaty. And yet the ICC is still out there, and we're still seeking to engage with it. Even if the Senate does not consider SIFTA in the near future, it is going to stay out there to shape the agenda domestically and internationally, and at some point or another to begin to drive U.S. policymaking. What I would really like to see is for the Senate not simply to reject treaties of this sort, but to reject them so absolutely and so vehemently that they entirely disappear from the realm of things that the U.S. considers or that drive U.S. policymaking. Second, the U.S. and other countries around the world, of course, now are establishing a very bad track record on signing broad, unenforceable treaties. Let me simply instance the Landmines Convention. Well, from one point of view, you might say that it's a good thing that bad treaties can't be enforced. And to an extent, I have some sympathy with that point of view. However, we enforce these treaties upon ourselves, whereas others do not. Treaties like this are diplomacy as showboating, and I object to them for many reasons. As I said earlier, treaties like this that are one-sided are inherently anti-sovereignty. They are bad and unequal treaties in and of themselves. And most fundamentally, they are bad for diplomacy. I take the international state system extremely seriously, and diplomacy is a vital and necessary and a good part of the international state system, and good treaties are a vital part of diplomacy. Bad treaties, on the other hand, are bad for diplomacy and therefore bad for the integrity of the international state system. By advocating bad and unenforceable treaties, the transnationalists are attacking from one end the same system that the Islamists are attacking from the other end. They are both anti-state organizations, and to the extent that we back bad treaties, we are contributing to the same problem. Finally, there is the problem of treating arms control as a human rights issue. This is a strategy which activists have increasingly adopted over the last decade and a half. Again, the Landmines Convention is the classic example of this. The UN Arms Trade Treaty, now in negotiation, which I spoke on here about 6 months ago, is another example. CIFTA is yet another example. All of these treaties are unserious. They achieve no substantial ends. They control only institutions and powers that are already democratic and controllable. And because they are pressed forward as human rights issues instead of as serious matters of international arms control, the treaties that are negotiated as a result are invariably bad, unenforceable, and ill thought through. And this is a further trend and a final trend which we have to be very careful, very wary of. Our human rights treaties are almost invariably unenforceable because they make very stringent demands on the domestic affairs of states around the world. Arms control treaties which pose as human rights treaties are even worse because they take that unenforceable model of human rights treaties and then apply it to the extremely serious subject of arms control, where above all, care, enforceability, and serious thought about consequences is vitally necessary. So for all these reasons, I encourage you to keep an eye on SIFTA going forward and to bear in mind the fact that even if it is not considered by the Senate in the near future, it will be out there shaping the agenda of this administration or a future administration, and it's going to shape the agenda in ways that are absolutely unhelpful to everything we believe in.